Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session, Embracing Organizational Equity. My name is Whitney Tucker, and I am Policy Director at NC Child. I'm going to introduce our fantastic speakers in just a moment, but before I do, I want to run through our quick housekeeping and instructions for everyone again. For those of you who were with us yesterday, sorry for the repetition, and for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are so excited to have you here, and please pay close attention. So first, this session is completely bilingual in both English and Spanish. We have a live interpreter on the line. Everyone will need to choose either the Spanish or English audio channel to hear any audio. If you do not choose an audio channel, you will not be able to hear the presenters. To choose a channel, look for the little image of a globe and the word interpretation on the bottom right side of your Zoom screen. Click that globe icon and choose either Spanish or English. If you choose the Spanish channel, you will hear the interpreter speaking in Spanish. You'll also be able to hear the English language presenters at a low volume in the background. If you do not want to hear the English in the background, you can just click that globe icon again and choose Mute Original Audio. Presenters, this is for you. Please be sure to speak slowly and clearly and take some breaks while you're talking. That's going to make our interpreter's job much easier. And for everyone, we have a lot of participants on this webinar today, so we're going to keep everyone on mute to preserve audio quality. To ask the presenters a question at any time during the presentation, type your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can use the chat box for more general comments or just to communicate with the moderator. When the presentation is over, we may have time for more question and answer, which I'm really hoping to leave a good amount of time for because I know today there are going to be a lot of really great questions and hopefully for some discussion. So we're going to do our best to summarize key themes and ask as many of your questions as possible. Because there are so many people on the line, we may not be able to get to all questions. Now, finally, this session is being recorded. The video will be available over the next week or two in both English and Spanish, and we will send you an email when all the recorded sessions are available. Also, it goes without saying really, but I am going to throw it out there. The views expressed on today's webinar are the views of the presenters, not necessarily of NC Child, though honestly, I probably personally agree with them. All right, now let's get started. I'm going to start with brief introductions of our speakers. Sterling Freeman is a leadership coach, organizational and cultural change agent, facilitator, counselor, and public speaker who has worked with many organizations on equity and who probably looks pretty familiar to a lot of folks who are joining us this morning. So thank you, Sterling, for being here. We are also so excited to be joined by Patricia Beier, who is the Executive Director of Wayne Action Group for Economic Solvency Incorporated in Goldsboro, North Carolina. A lot of you are also, I'm sure, very familiar with Patricia's work and her excellent advocacy for children, and also specifically with equity in mind. So we're really excited to hear from both of them today. Before we do, I want to just quickly talk about the fact that this keeps being a struggle for so many agencies, right? To get started in organizational change that reflects the sort of work that we as child advocates are often trying to do externally in communities, right? When we turn that race equity lens back on ourselves, often we do not like what we see. Right? And lots of different tools and resources are out there to help organizations with this process, but still it seems to be a struggle for a lot of people. At NC Child, we are part of a network of child advocacy organizations across the country called the Kids Count Network through the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And to try and help organizations in the Kids Count Network, the Casey Foundation created a guide back in 2014 that was specifically focused on advancing equity and inclusion in organizations. They called it the Race Equity and Inclusion Action Guide. And it includes their 7 steps to advancing race equity. And so I wanted to just start and throw those out as sort of a frame for where I think a lot of organizations get advice. I think these steps really cover a lot of the things that we hear often as, best practice. But then I want to turn it over to you guys and hear from you about what's worked in your experience. So just running through these steps really quickly. Step 1 is establish an understanding of race, equity, and inclusion principles. Step 2 is engage affected populations and stakeholders. Step 3 is gather and analyze disaggregated data. Step 4, conduct systems analysis of root causes of inequities. Step 5, identify strategies and target resources to address root causes of inequities. Step 6, conduct race equity impact assessment for all policies and decision making. And then step 7, continuously evaluate effectiveness and adapt strategies. Now that's a lot. And also I'm going to drop the link to that resource in the chat so that folks can, have a look at that. But what I've found is that as a part of the Kids Count Network, organizations often find it really difficult to get past even step 1 or step 2, establishing that shared understanding of the principles or effectively engaging, relevant stakeholders, especially when those relevant stakeholders are within their own organizations. So to get us started, I just want to throw out this question. What are the steps that your organization, or maybe Sterling in your case, organizations that you've worked with, have taken to start implementing some racial equity measures internally? And whoever wants to start, just unmute yourself first and consider yourself the winner.
I guess Sterling's going to let me win. Good morning, everyone. I can say that for our organization, there were pretty much, as you described, some of those things. I think the first thing was having those honest conversations about race equity and what it means, and making sure there's a shared understanding of that. And then secondly, when looking at it, certainly trying to convene conversations with our stakeholders. And for us, our primary stakeholder is our community, but also our board of directors. I think when you look at governance, it's important that your board is really understanding what that actually means as an organization, and then looking at your practices and your policies and all the other things that go into that to make sure that it is an integral part of everything that you have going on. And so for us, it was kind of a very we took those foundational steps first, so that we could all be on the same page. Being a community action agency is a little different probably than some other agencies, because at the root of community action, the legislation that birthed community action was a part of the civil rights legislation. So I think when you go back to the history of organizations like mine from the 1960s, they did a lot more, equity and special racial equity and advocacy was a huge part in those original years, just because of what was going on in the country back then. But I think coming back to those roots and coming back to that and having the conversation with those of us who were engaged in this work really right now was important. So important that our board, chose racial equity as being one of their 2020 focus areas over a year ago. So we were intentional about that, when doing our strategic planning, looking at our mission and our vision for our organization. All of this was really, really rooted in that and in that conversation. And so really the steps that we have taken and are taking are very similar to the ones that you described that Annie Casey Foundation has outlined for us.
That's great to hear. Sterling, yours line up with the Casey Foundation's recommendations too, or no?
Yeah, Whitney, thank you so much for the question. Thank you for having me on, and thanks for everybody who's on. So I do, I resonate with what the Casey Foundation has laid out. What I will say about them is that certainly this is not a linear process. It is an iterative process, right? And so one of the things that I'm thinking about as I look at those steps is that there are pieces of those steps in terms of engaging folks and data gathering and those sorts of things, creating principles. Those are sort of ongoing things that are sort of part of the journey, perpetually. part of the journey, right? And so it's not iterative. So you know, if I had a depiction of these steps, I might put them in a circle or something. I don't know, or some squiggly line rather than making it look linear. However, there's one other thing I want to say about those steps. I actually think there's some stuff before these steps. And what I mean by that is I think that this is going to sound obvious, but in terms of steps to sort of getting into infusing equity, one of the things that has to happen is that leadership has to make a firm decision that this is the direction and the way that the organization is going to go. And it is also helpful if that leadership within the organization, that CEO or that executive director or president, is also in alignment with the board. That's helpful. I'm not going to say it's essential, but it's helpful to have that alignment with the board. And we can talk about the problematics of misalignment later if we like. The other thing that I want to say about this is I actually think that there is some work to be done around preparing, when we're doing internal equity work, preparing the staff team, both white folks and BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color folks, preparing them before you enter in to the space of doing that work. I'm learning that even in some of our work with organizations, I think that there is a step that we can add towards helping people understand what the process is going to be like. And so I think that there is sort of some pre-planning before we get to the very powerful steps that Casey laid out, with which I agree. There's some pre-planning in terms of preparing the staff, alignment with the board, and those sorts of things, because as it gets deeper and as it gets more difficult, the organization needs to be able to look back to what its motivation was at the very beginning. And that can't be because of a grant requirement. It has to be because this is what the organization knows is essential to carrying out its mission.
That is so critical. And I'm wondering, in your experience, and Patricia, I mean, you weigh in here too, if this is something that you've dealt with, there are organizations where the staff might be at this point and ready for this change, but leadership isn't yet. And in that case, is an organization still able to make change, or does it always have to include that critical buy-in from, you know, organizational leaders and board leadership?
Mm-hmm. Hey, Whitney, are you referring to leaders as the president, CEO of the organization, or are you talking about board leadership?
Yes, so president, CEO of organization, if they are not on board, but everyone else on staff is this a thing that can still work?
Yeah, well, in that case, I do think that, and we have had situations like this where we have counseled people that there is some more work to be done around discussions around values and who the organization wants to be and that sort of thing. If you have internally some misalignment in terms of the direction, that is, all staff is ready, but the CEO or the president, you know, or whomever is not quite ready, right? So I think that kind of conversation needs to be had. And here it is. One of the things that has to happen in that is something that has to happen throughout. If we're talking about doing racial equity work, then the first thing that we have to get our minds around is that, and typically in leadership in these organizations is white leadership, typically. What we have to get our heads around in this case is that white people don't know best, right? So we have to lean on the wisdom of those who are most impacted by this work. And so that conversation has to be had early on if there is that kind of tension between the direction of the organization, between leadership and staff.
That's really helpful. We had a question that came in right around the time that I was asking that said, what is the dynamic when staff is catalyst for change, but the leadership is not? And so I'm wondering if, does that same advice really stand if we're not talking about president, CEO of the organization, if we're talking about a board instead?
Yeah, well, I think with the board, what I think is just a tad bit different is that often that solidarity amongst the leadership and the staff within the organization can help sort of carry that work. So there's opportunity to do good work outside of, right, the work of the board. However, what I will say is that there should be certainly the attempt up front to figure out what the trajectory of the work is, trying to engage the board, and also holding open the possibility that the board can be on a different track as long as the board is doing its work, right? And so I think that that's the kind of difference between those two things.
Interesting.
And I have to say, for me, Whitney, I think that it would have been, you know, as the CEO or the executive director of the organization, certainly having those conversations with our board of directors initially was something that I felt was just like paramount, you know, that there be congruency, because they are the people that are legally and fiscally responsible for the organization and for everything that happens, making sure there was congruency and what, you know, and what our mission and vision was, and then what they saw that being, and making sure that race equity was at the forefront, but also letting them know our roots, as I mentioned before, as a community action agency. When they decided to come aboard this board, there are certain things that you got to look at when you talk about economic mobility and economic self-sufficiency. Certainly, racial equity was one of those major factors in trying to make sure that we're able to perpetuate what our history is and what our roots are, and then also how we want to move forward. So I just want to concur with some of the things that have been said about that is paramount. But I do believe that the person in leadership, and Sterling is right, a lot of times the CEO or the executive director is not a person of color. And so sometimes there may not be that, you know, that recognition actually, that this is so important, because the experiences have been different. But for me, being able to share those experiences, you know, from my lens, and then looking at it from the lens really beyond just me, of the people that we serve and those who have been disenfranchised, and what we say we're going to do was paramount. And so being able to have those conversations with your governance and your board, and making sure that they all understand first, because a lot of times people don't understand what it means. They think that it's something like giving something to someone, or something that, you know, they don't understand what it means. You know, equity, you know, they don't understand it. So having those conversations, I think, early on are very important, so that everybody can realize, you know what direction that we're trying to go in as an organization, based on whatever your foundation is and what your core values are, and then what your mission is and what you're trying to do for the community.
That makes a lot of sense. I had originally planned to have us talk through some of these issues and then take questions at the end, but I think that, you know, because of the sort of advice that you guys are giving, and the way that it's clearly resonating with people based on what's popping up in the Q&A box, I want to try and kind of weave some of these in as we go along, if that's all right with y'all. We have one question where someone says, can you say more about the components that you see, Sterling, and I mean, Patricia, I'm sure that you've seen this in your work as well, that you see in the pre-work that organizations need to do. Sterling, you mentioned original motivation. This person says that they love that, but they've also seen the Emotional Justice Foundation as PrEP is essential. Are there other things that you feel organizations really need to keep in mind as they're establishing sort of this pre-step to starting any sort of organizational change around race equity?
Yeah, well, I think that I want to agree, if I understand that question and that's the statement in question correctly. I do want to agree about the emotional piece of it, right? And that's what I meant by sort of establishing early on opportunities for white, you know, staff, and also BIPOC staff. And I realize that's very complicated, but I'm going to use Black, Indigenous people of color right now. To do some upfront kind of work, because part of establishing that space is about sort of explaining and making clear the emotional and mental burden of this work on BIPOC folks. And so I think that it is really important for white folks to understand that. It's important to have in place, built in, how is it that this organization is going to take care of Black, Indigenous people of color through this process? So that also means, again, talking about what to expect about the trajectory of the work, to understand that aspirations do not, what an organization aspires to do does not sort of lessen the impact of who it is today, right? And so what that does is that tension of aspiration and where we're going often sort of bumps up against where the organization is today. And that's a big, tough burden to bear, particularly for Black and Indigenous people of color who wanted this done yesterday, right? And so I think that I agree with that sort of creating those containers early on in order to attend to the impact, emotional, mental, so on and so forth, of this work, and having all parties understand that so that people know their roles and how to sort of do this work and what to take on, and to make sure that it doesn't become an inordinate burden of those who are most impacted and affected, and that is Black, Indigenous, and people of color.
Patricia, do you have anything to add to that as far as components of potential pre-work?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I kind of alluded to it a little bit about having those conversations and actually honest and transparent conversations. These are difficult conversations for folk a lot of times. Particularly, people in the majority culture, white people, is hard sometimes. Sometimes it's hard and emotional, for them because sometimes of a lack of understanding. Sometimes it's hard for people of color also, because of just, as Sterling just mentioned, some of the, the burdens that have been, borne for all this long time. And then, people, being able to have that transparency and honesty when you're looking at these assessments, and when people are really looking at, who they are, what they're, I always tell everybody, and this is just, the gospel according to me, not anybody else, that we are a product of all of the 4 E's, I believe, a lot of times: our environment, our exposure, our education, and our experiences. And a lot of times when folk have not had experiences, that lend itself to looking at equity a certain way, or when you look at education, sometimes geographical. I'm going to be honest, I'm in Eastern North Carolina. So the way that we talk about, or the way that we engage, is not going to be the same as you all engage in Raleigh or Chapel Hill or even Charlotte. And it's different. This is a conservative community. And so sometimes those conversations make people, when you start having them, they start moving in their seats, they start feeling uncomfortable. All of a sudden they got to go to the bathroom. I'm just going to, so people, it is an emotional process for everybody involved. So having that, being honest, and just like, and as Sterling mentioned, looking and saying, this is what we aspire to be, but it does not negate who we are right now and all the good work we've done, in our case, for 50 some years in our organization and other organizations as well. So yeah, I think having those conversations early on and being as transparent and honest and doing that assessment and that ground level work from the very beginning, each of us individually, so that we can scaffold up collaboratively, is very important, because we are a product of a lot of people, of what the environment that we've been in for a long time. And for some people, for whatever reason, talking about racial equity is frightening or scary. And sometimes it's because of lack of understanding, or just like I said, their experiences, their exposure, their environment, and their education. So yes, I agree with that.
So you guys have talked a lot about the sort of barriers that come up just in getting an organization prepared to move forward in internal equity work. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to some of the problems and the barriers that pop up when they go through this process. So everybody's on the same page, they've gotten started, maybe they're doing an assessment internally, maybe they're gathering more data. What are some of the things that you've seen that can happen and kind of derail that process, and that people need to keep an eye out for in their own processes? Sterling, go ahead if you want to start. So polite.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Whitney. So there's just several things that come to mind really quickly about that, and maybe some more will come. But during the process, right, we talk about equity as a mindset and a method. And so what has to happen is that there does have to be a shift in our thinking, right? And one of the things that we find that is sort of, I think, sort of difficult sometimes to get people to think differently about, and I think it is because of white dominant norms and the way that we sort of normatively behave, is that training is not change. It's hard sometimes, not for folks to intellectually understand that, but it's hard for folks to embody that, because so often, once we've kind of gotten the tools, there is this expectation that things are going to be fixed, right? And the reality is that we're not going to fix something with a training that is embedded in our culture for at least 400 years, at least, right? So we're not going to fix that. We're always working on this. And so what I think is that this thing about training is not change is one thing in terms of getting people's mindset. The other thing that might be obvious that is a barrier, it may be obvious, but it's the truth, is just the different lived experiences of BIPOC folks and white folks. It's that dissonance is just there. That is part of the tension that is always with us. And so what often happens in terms of kind of sometimes upending the work or that struggle is that things that feel like big risks to white people are things that BIPOC folks are looking at and saying that's past due, right? And so that's not if I could talk like the kids, that's not shade at anybody. It's just the fact that different lived experience and that tension is inevitable that it is like that. And so what I think we have to keep doing is we have to keep naming that different lived experience. And again, once again, turn our attention to where the wisdom is in terms of what's needed when we're doing this kind of change work. And lastly, I'll just say the lack of understanding a lot of times in terms of what's required in terms of an investment in this work. Sometimes I think people, I think it's changing, but sometimes we still get that group that wants the checklist, right? And there is no checklist. There's an investment of time, an investment of emotion, an investment of course, dollars, but all of these things you have to invest in just as if you're investing in something else that's very important to you, right? So I think that understanding the investment that's required in the change process is important as well.
Trisha, any thoughts on that, on the barriers that pop up? I feel like he covered some major ones that I've seen even just in my short time at nonprofits, but what about you?
Yeah, I just echo that. I agree about the investments and the fact that it's ongoing. It's not a checklist type process. It's ongoing. It's evolutionary. I mean, it's just everything. It never stops. It's always an intentionality. It's always a look back. It's always a look forward. It's always a look around. It's always, it's just something that has to really permeate everything.
Well, with that excellent process in mind, very exciting work, very difficult work, I think we can all agree for most agencies. I want to turn to our rapidly growing Q&A box because I want there to be time for us to hit a lot of these. And so I'm just going to try and kind of run through, and then, whichever one of you feels moved to speak in response to any of these, then, tag yourself in. First question, do you think that racial equity and justice work can be actualized in organizational structures with white leadership?
Well, I think the first thing that I would say to that question is defining what leadership is. Part of the challenge with this is actually challenging sort of the traditional hierarchical structures as they are. So if that is on the table, then the possibilities as it relates to leadership are numerous, right? But if we're going to assume the sort of what we typically see, yeah, I do think that this work can take root. I think at the end of the day, I'll say this, that if we're going to dismantle racism and we're going to move ourselves toward racial equity, I say this all the time, we need enough white people who are going to decide to do that and do it. I mean, just by the sheer numbers, right? And most of the folks who are in these organizations are white-led organizations, and that's predictable. And so what I'm saying is I'm saying that if we have folks in those positions who make those decisions and who invest, in this work, and who realize that actually dismantling racism is actually white folks' work, then sure, it can happen. The question is, do we have the will, right? And do we have the energy, and do we have the resilience in order to make it happen?
Yeah, that's a great response. Patricia, I see you nodding. I think we're good with that response.
I agree wholeheartedly. You know, of course, I'm not white, and I'm in leadership, but my board is predominantly. So I think, you know, you talk about leadership, it includes not just the CEO, but those other folk who are in leadership. On our leadership team, you know, it's at one point, you know, the leadership team for the organization, I was the only person of color on the leadership team. I'm the CEO, but still the only one. And then our board is predominantly white too. So I think it's just a matter, like Sterling said, of people being willing to do the work, because we can't do this on our own. There's no way. There's no way, because it's a system that we did not develop. So there's no way we can dismantle it on our own. And so I think everybody taking ownership is going to be is crucial. So I agree with him wholeheartedly.
I think to Sterling's point too about the clarification of leadership within organizations, we have a question here that I think is an interesting one on that point. It says, do you all think that the board structure in and of itself upholds power dynamics of whiteness and white supremacy? It functions so separately from those most impacted and community with lived experiences of oppression. That's a question. And then they said, how do we start to bridge that gap more effectively? I think between boards and impacted communities. I think to their point, it's not the case for every board, but it is the case for many, that the power dynamics of whiteness and white supremacy are really upheld there in membership and, you know, in the way that they operate. And so do you all think that that structure can be an effective one to work with or within to make some racial equity change?
Okay, Patricia, thank you. Thank you for that question. So I resonate with what this questioner has said about oftentimes the board and the board members and their proximity or lack thereof to those who are most impacted by this work, right? And so, yeah, I think in some ways, there is just sort of an embedded kind of asymmetrical kind of power relationships right there, right? And so I think because of that, oftentimes, you know, there can be a lack of a real understanding, right, of what the impact of race and racism is on those who are most impacted and that sort of thing. So it goes to the same thing that I was saying about staff. Are there other ways to configure boards? And I'm talking about outside of fiduciary responsibility and that sort of thing, which also is a conversation we could have about like fiduciary, and is fiduciary responsibility actually embedded in white dominant culture in a way that it sort of keeps these boards from being able to do the right thing in some instances. So I think that, yes, I mean, it is possible, but I think, again, we have to put on the table the very structures of these things, right? Like, how can it be differently structured? I mean, for example, just in terms of the way some boards operate, you know, you almost have to be white to serve on them. And and what I mean by that is that, you know, the ways in which people are able to show up in the world and are even able to be given to be able to serve on a board, there are some barriers for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, right? From a practical standpoint. So I think that, again, that's an excellent question. I think we have to start unpacking whether the structures that we have around our boards are the ones that can be most effective in terms of getting some of this work done.
And I agree with that. And I think I have to give a shout out again to, you know, being a part of the Community Action Network, and the fact that from the very beginning, we had to have a tripartite board when we look at community actions, because they did, as I mentioned before, they came about as a part of, you know, with the same legislation from the Civil Rights Movement. So this tripartite board structure says that there has to be people that represent the folk that we serve on our board. One third has to be public interest, and 1/3 has to be private interest. And I think, you know, when you look at that, that gives a lot of flexibility, but also means that we're gonna have diversity on the board, just economic diversity, if nothing else, and then certainly most of the time racial diversity as well. And so I think it's important, it's incumbent on the organizations and the boards themselves if they want to get in, really want to be serious about this, to look at their bylaws, to look at their foundation, to look at their processes, to make sure that they're intentional about making sure there's diversity and equity in everything that they do, including their board membership.
That is so important. So it sounds like you can have, a board structure that helps the lead in this work, but not if you're not willing to address the ways that white supremacy shows up just in how you structure that board, right? So it's not that you have a board that's the problem. It's perhaps how your board operates.
And Whitney, I mean, I'm sorry. The only thing I want to add to that is that let us remember that we're actually talking about creating something that we've never seen before. If we're talking about racial equity, where have we seen it, right? I mean, in a real way. And so in that sense, really, in theory, all is up for grabs in terms of how we might restructure things. We don't know what's most effective. But we do know that to bring a hermeneutic that is an interpretation, to bring an interpretation of suspicion to everything is something that will propel us forward in terms of trying things, trying to be different and trying to do differently and not getting too frightened when we put some of the sort of age-old things that we've always done, when we interrogate those things and say, you know what, we need to restructure that.
Interesting. Patricia, really quickly, someone asked if you could repeat the way that your board is composed. They were really interested in that.
Yeah, that is part of the legislation that birth community action agencies. We have a tripartite board composition, which means you have a lot of flexibility in the number of your boards, but it has to be divisible by 3. So 1/3 of your organization or your board has to be made up of elected public officials or their appointees. 1/3 has to be made up of people who represent private interests, and 1/3 have to be representatives of the poor. And those are the terms that are actually used in the legislation. So it is a tripartite board that makes sure that you had that. And I mean, I think this was kind of even unique for the 1960s, I must say, is that, but also intentional to make sure that you had representation before it became so popular to have consumer representation and on advisory and governance. This was a part of this from the mid-60s, from the start of our organization. So it's representatives of the poor, public elected officials, and people that represent private interests.
I'm just gonna jump around here in the Q&A box because we have so many questions. One here, what to do when Black leadership is more conservative in policymaking or decision-making than white team members? What if white decision makers in an organization are bolder in policy development and are willing to financially invest more than Black decision makers after using racial equity impact assessments as the driver?
Well, I mean, at one level, if there are white folks who are taking more risk, at the end of the day, that actually makes sense to me. Because, we know what it means historically for BIPOC folks to take risk in this country. And it can mean, not to be sensationalist about it, but all we have to do is check our record, right? It can mean death, for us to open our mouths, to speak truth, to be prophetic, right? So, I mean, some of this conservatism, it may come from a particular mindset, but I think there's also a way in which, that's why I think it's important to set up these sort of containers for this work, because there's a way in which for BIPOC folks to be able to do the work they need to do together in order to also challenge one another and support one another in this work, right? So I think that's part of it. I think figuring out how to have those conversations, because it is not about those white staff or those white folks who are more willing to turn and tell BIPOC folks, particularly Black people, what to do, right? And so I think that so it makes sense. So let us remember that to say that white risk and BIPOC risk is the same is a false equivalency. It's not the same risk. And so I think that there are some layers to pull back when we think about, the kind of the diversity. We know that, Black and Indigenous people of color are not monolithic. So there are some layers to pull back when we see those differences. And that's why I think that there have to be different containers to do some work apart, as well as doing the work together.
I think relatedly, we had a question where an organization had traditionally people of color in leadership positions, and they were met, with what they were surprised by as like a lot of resistance or negative commentary around exploring and promoting race equity. And they wanted to know how best to initiate conversations with Black organizational leaders who may not want to do the work to improve racial equity. And so I think to your point about, risk and the need for, separate containers to talk about different priorities and different feelings around this work, what is a good way for staff to kind of broach that topic with people of color who are in leadership in their organizations?
Well, yeah, Whitney. I mean, I think it's a win if staff recognize, right, the opportunity that lies within these sort of different containers for work. So I think it's all about sort of offering, for shared understanding, the ways in which this work can be done. I think it also is helpful, and let me say out loud, it doesn't have to be me and my colleagues, but it's helpful to have a thought partner walking alongside you in order to help frame this, just to have that third party voice. And so I think that's a very important piece of it as well. And so I think that there are ways to do that, but I think it's all in sort of upfront framing. The other piece that I would add to that, though, is that people have to be allowed to not have to operate within the context of everybody's assumptions. So we don't need to assume that all of the Black people are going to be gung-ho about doing racial equity work, right? But what we do need to do is we do need to provide proper space for those stories to be told. And some of that might be the upfront work, and it might take a while. So the last thing that I'll say about that is providing the space, talking about these things, having someone alongside you. And the last thing is slow down. Because I think that this work, people, well-meaning folks, and I celebrate it, by the way, want to get this done. White folks and Black and Indigenous and people of color. I get it, and I think that's great. And we have to slow down, because if we don't understand our system well, if we don't have a shared understanding, if we don't understand the roots of the problems, we can sometimes move forward and do more harm than good.
Patricia, I see you nodding. We actually have another question that's for you. Folks wanted to repeat the 4 E's that you talked about earlier.
Oh, wow.
Dig into those.
Okay. So for me, and in my experiences, I think that for the most part, and this it's hard, I don't want to put anybody in a box, but I do believe that to just try to get it so that we, in a way that's easier to understand. The 4 E's that I always see is that we all are product of our environments, and a lot of times that includes your family environment, your geographical environment, all those other things. So it's environment, education, and that's formalized or informal, exposure, and experience. So it's environment, education, exposure, and experiences.
Thank you for that. Going on, so so many questions coming in. So people said, okay, are there self-assessments that white folk can do to help them discover their own unconscious bias? Most well-meaning white folk are unaware of their own bias that impacts how they do their work. By becoming aware of their own bias, they can begin to address it. Maybe it's a way to get them past their denial. Thoughts on that? Patricia, how about you first this time?
Well, I think there's quite a few assessments out there that look at things, and Sterling certainly would be more of an expert, but some of the things that we looked at in assessments were on implicit bias, and looking at some of those things. One of them that we looked at was the Harvard one. There's others that we've used as well, but I think there's, a plethora actually of assessments and things that you can look at. Just looking at which one would, better fit your organization or your community, I think is going to be important. But yeah, the implicit bias test, and I see somebody just put it up there. I think that's just one of many that probably can be utilized, because you're right. People sometimes don't realize, that they have those struggles, or that they have those biases that really dictate the way they operate in their day-to-day lives.
Jerome, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree with Patricia in terms of the many, assessments out there. Of course, the Harvard test is a very popular one. What I would say, I guess another idea that I'd add to it is assessments, but not assessments in and of themselves. I think that this is where it's really important to do the caucus work, and having a container for white folks, in this case, per the questioner's question, to be able to pull themselves through and talk about this, to challenge one another, to learn together, to be confused together, to question, to hold on. That is where those conversations in an intentional and systematic way, which we do a lot with client partners. My partner, Kathleen Krabs, of course, manages those white caucuses. And so I think it's important. So assessments, yes, but not without really engaging around kind of what's live and what sort of emerges from those sort of things, and how they're showing up in concrete ways in organizations.
That also makes a lot of sense. We can't just determine that we have a bias and consider that a step, right? I think we already know that, and we need to be willing to move past that pretty quickly. That's great. Question here. Someone says that in larger organizations with many levels of staffing and a hierarchy of leadership, they're wondering, how do we ensure that the conversations and messages, particularly those defining the core values and commitments, that those messages don't get lost in translation between multiple levels of staffing? For example, when direct service providers working with children and family don't have access to the higher level leadership meetings and conversations. I'm wondering, is this another case of a need to change the leadership structure itself, or do you feel that there are better ways to communicate this that could get around that?
I think for us as an organization, and I would say we're fairly large with about 230 staff, that it's incumbent on the leadership to make sure that the information or all communications, go to all levels of staffing. So the direct service, because really it's a parallel process. If we're not getting to the folk who are serving people every day, then that means it means nothing if only people in leadership or management know about, what our commitment is. If the people who are out there doing the work every day directly and don't know it. And so I think it's incumbent on, in my opinion, it's my responsibility as executive director to make sure that all communications and about what our values are, our vision, our mission, and how we embed racial equity into everything that we do. It's my responsibility to make sure that that gets out to everyone who is a part of our organization.
Yeah, I agree with Patricia, Whitney, certainly from the standpoint that given our organizational structures, and so the way that they typically are in terms of hierarchy, I would say that, and I'm thinking about a particular large system we were in, I would say being able to work sort of methodically in different parts of that system begins to build a kind of a groundswell of support and people who are moving in the same direction. And that's a way to kind of, for lack of a better word, maybe put some pressure upwards in terms of trying to shift culture. So that's one way. But I think to your point, Whitney, I think here again, we're talking about racial equity. We're talking about building something we've never seen before. So why not put organizational structure on the table and just interrogate it with a racial equity lens? What might we find if we do that?
Interesting. To this organizational structure point, we have a question. Someone says that they're wondering about you guys' thoughts on coalitions or similarly, composed groups that want to engage in some sort of racial equity process internally, but there isn't a board. Folks are generally serving for several years. Generally, no one is paid to run these coalitions, but they are given time from their official organizations to allow them to serve on these and to meet once a month. And thus they may not always make or have the time to engage in a really thorough way. What are some steps that the groups that are organized like coalitions, more informally that way, how can they still promote racial equity internally? I think it's a tough one. You might need a second to reflect.
All right, thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Whitney. So in terms of coalition, right? So you have volunteer folks who, are generously, certainly giving of their time. I think the ideal is to figure out who that core body is within that coalition, right? Like, because we know that as we're in change processes like this, as we have people moving in and out, the group changes, right? If you're missing one core person, the group will change. And so I think it's important to figure out, if you can, that core body, not to be the fount of all wisdom, but to be the body that's going to help carry and catalyze this work. You need that. And in fact, in all organizations with which we work, we always have what's called an equity leadership team. That's a core body that helps carry the work, although it is the work of the whole staff. So, excuse me. So I think it's very important. The other thing I would say, though, is that I think there are ways to just create a learning community. We've had situations in which a group just started as a learning community with resources, having conversations and kind of supporting those conversations. And then it sort of morphed and evolved into a group that was sort of tight and that sort of self-selected to stay. And it then morphed into a body that actually did some good work together. So it depends, but I think if you can find that core, that would help carry the work.
Patricia, do you see the same thing, that there generally needs to be, this core organizing group, even in a less formally structured organization like a coalition?
Yes, I do. I think there always has to be, because a lot of times, generally speaking, and certainly I know this is a generalization, coalitions are coalesce, for lack of a better word, or come together for a cause. And so if that is going to be something that can be impacted by a lack of racial equity, which I can't think of any cause in America that would not be impacted by that, certainly there should be some of that conversation going along. And if they're representing organizations, that's why. So it would be, in an ideal world, every organization would have that as a part of their focus. And so whoever their representative would be that came to this coalition, if they got time off, or whether, they're volunteering, whether they're volunteering on their own or in the auspices of their organization, that would be part of what their thought would be as well. And so I think having a core group, particularly if you're knowing that the issue that you are being a coalition to address is impacted by this, and as I mentioned before, I can't think of anything in America that's not impacted by it, then certainly somebody has to bring that to the forefront and in the conversation in some way. And so if there's just one or two gathered that can do that, as we say from a biblical perspective, then just do what you have to do so that you can push forward, push the vision forward. Because as I mentioned, I can't think of anything that we would be building coalitions around that would not involve racial equity. I can't think of anything.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, doing the Lord's work, got to have at least a couple people who are committed to it, right? Speaking of organizational, change agents, and the need to make sure that you have those on the team, we also have a question here that I think is an important one about folks who are worried that they might get pushed out of organizations to make way for that work. Someone has said, how have you framed it when a colleague may say something like, all this attention on equity, how does that impact my job? Are they going to get rid of me in order to bring in a person of color? A person apparently had said this during a meeting, and this poster wasn't sure how to respond to that. What do you guys think about that, that note?
Okay, Patricia, thanks. Yeah, so I appreciate that question. So here's one way that I want to think about this. If organization ABC says that, you know, we're going to move in a certain direction, and so that means that we're going to implement, you know, 1, 2, 3 programs to make sure we accomplish this objective. The expectation is going to be that all who are part of the team, the staff, whatever their connection is, will be to get on board and to be ready to point themselves in the direction of those 1, 2, 3 programs so the mission can be fulfilled. There are going to be competencies that come with that, skills that come with that to implement those programs or whatever it is. And so people are going to be expected to perform, right? Just like anything else. So what I would pose is how is that different if the organization decides that it is going in the direction of centering racial equity? What I would say is that is going to change how the organization operates, and there are going to be certain skills and competencies that are required to operate that way, and that people, whether they're white or people of color, BIPOC folks, are going to be expected to take on those skills and build their capacity to go in the direction that the organization is going in. So I look at that as everything else, not as a sign or a portal towards getting rid of folks. I actually see it as an opportunity for folks to be able to build their capacity to take the organization to the next level. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say, though, is a more, maybe this is getting fundamental to how race operates, right? The fact that we are configured the way we are, right, in our nonprofit organizations, you probably could put this into the corporate sector as well. We did not get to the place we are without race operating. So it's always operating. So the question we need to be having is not about racial equity and pushing anybody out. The question we need to be asking is, how long and whom have we kept out? And how do we want to be a different organization, right? So that we make sure that we're not employing policies and practices that would be racist and keep people out, as we've done for 400 years, right? That would be the reframing of all of that in my mind.
Patricia, do you have anything to add to that before I wrap us up today? Like, yeah, that was a lot, right? We have a couple more minutes because I got wrapped up in getting to all of these great questions. We still have so many that aren't going to get answered. I'm sorry, y'all, but in our last 2 minutes here, wondering if each of you could maybe in 30 seconds to a minute, just list out your main takeaways for organizations from what you've learned through your experiences. What is it that you think they need to keep in mind as they sort of embark on this process of incorporating racial equity internally at their organizations? Patricia, you go ahead.
I would say, the takeaways or the things that need to be thought about really is, historical perspective, honesty, transparency, the fact that all those investments we talked about are real, emotional, financial, physical, mental, everything. So those are and then the honesty and looking at, like I mentioned before, your environmental factors too that come into play, and then being intentional about it and deliberate no matter what. That's the thing that's been for me. We've been, being intentional and deliberate no matter what, because there are going to be, the potential for hurt feelings for whatever reasons or misunderstandings, but you got to plow through. You got to plow through.
Those are great takeaways. Sterling, what about you?
Yeah, thank you, Patricia, for that. Just really quickly, without unpacking all of these, sort of just remembering that in terms of dismantling, right, racism and sort of opening the opportunity for racial equity work, have to be honest about how that is white folks' work to do. And we need that kind of leadership to make that happen. The other thing is that caucusing is essential to this work, being able to create spaces for BIPOC folks and white folks to do their different work, and also then to bring them together. That is essential to the work. You can't measure this by quantitative data all the time. I'm sorry for my data folks, but you need stories. You need the qualitative piece. You need to be able to see and hear how things are shifting in your organizations, and you can do that if we pay attention to it. And then I think certainly figuring out the board's role and work in this journey early on is another takeaway. And then there are others, but the last thing I would say is that we mustn't forget that the way that race is operating, it is connected, right, to also a deep sort of normative patriarchal structure. It's rooted in that as well, if we take this all the way back to the creation of race. So all of those kinds of oppressions are happening. And so the last thing I would say in a takeaway in these systems, one of the things we have to do is we have to believe the most scrutinized minds and bodies in these systems, and that's Black women.
And on that note, thank you.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, right. We have been so glad to have you both here to share your expertise. We really appreciate it. And thank you all of our attendees for all of your excellent questions. Hope to see you at some of our other panels later this afternoon. Have a great day.
Thank you, Whitney. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.